Thanks, David. Hear me okay? Yep. It's a huge pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague for many years, Dr. Greg Pauly. Greg is now the director of the Urban Nature Research Center and the curator of herpetology at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. He's a native Californian, got his bachelor's degree at UC Davis, then came here to UT Austin for his PhD, where he studied the evolution of toads. He's published about 70 scholarly papers, as well as authored an award-winning book called Wild LA, about the persistence of nature within that huge metropolitan area. Since moving to the Los Angeles County Museum, Greg has sort of transitioned from being primarily an evolutionary biologist to really one of the sort of co-founders and leaders of a movement to study urban ecology, and in particular to take advantage of the tremendous possibilities of community science. That's what he's going to talk about today. His talk is titled "The Next Frontier of Science is in Your Backyard with You and Your Smartphone." So thank you very much, Greg, for talking to us. Welcome to Texas.
Thank you, Harry. Well, thanks, Harry, for that introduction, and David as well for inviting me. And now that I know that Larry sponsors this, thanks much, Larry, for sponsoring this series. That's great to know. Yeah, so as Harry mentioned, I think we're one slide. We're one slide too far ahead. But there's the actual title: "The Next Frontier of Science is in Your Backyard with You and Your Smartphone." And I truly mean that I really think that the next frontier of science really is in say urbanized places. So at the present, about 58% of the human population lives in an urban area, and by 2050 that number is going to jump to about 66%, which means that if we're going to take some responsibility for this global biodiversity crisis that we as a species have created, it means that we're going to have to start doing a lot more work in urban areas to try to understand the conservation, ecology, and evolution of those species that happen to find themselves living around us. And I think at some level that's sort of a depressing way to start a talk, but what I want to highlight here is that I truly believe that if we pick up, I left mine over here, that these devices, smartphones and digital cameras, really are changing the ways in which we can study local biodiversity. So as you just saw, I also sometimes when I talk about this, I use this title: "Is Community Science the Next Revolution in Conservation, Ecology, and Behavior Research?" And I'm going to try to convince you that that is the case. So the first thing, let's just make sure that we understand what community science is all about. I'm sort of stealing a definition from the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. So if you've heard of eBird or Project Nestwatch or any of the other incredibly successful projects that Cornell has come up with, this is the definition that they use. Now they call it citizen science. We use a synonym. We use community science as a synonym, and we do that because we just want to make sure we're not excluding people who maybe otherwise might feel excluded by the word citizenship for reasons of political citizenship. So the definition that Cornell uses and that I use is projects in which volunteers partner with scientists to answer real-world questions. And I also want to make sure that we talk a little bit about this word revolution, because I'm going to use it a whole lot today. And I just want to make it clear that I'm not using that as hyperbole. I truly do feel that community science or citizen science or participatory science, whatever name you like, really is revolutionizing the ways in which we can answer questions in diverse fields. And that includes astronomy, biochemistry, and a huge suite of fields within the biological sciences. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples today, but I think we can think of this much more broadly. So the examples that I'm going to give are, we're going to start with thinking about conservation research, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which community science can be used to document invasive species. And then we'll completely switch gears and we'll talk about using community science to study ecological gradients in otherwise difficult to observe characters. And then I know there's a bunch of animal behavior folks on the call, so we're also going to have a big chunk that's dedicated to thinking about how community science can be used to study events that otherwise might be rarely observed by any one person. The example I'm going to be giving is going to be focusing on mating lizards, but I'll show some other potential examples as well. So we'll jump right into part 1, which is thinking about using community science to document invasive species. So after I left the University of Texas, I spent some time at UC Davis as a postdoc, and then I found myself at a job in the middle of Los Angeles. And if you can see my pointer, which I can't currently see, I work right about there, which is right in the middle of this huge urbanized area. And in finding myself in LA, I started to think about the fact that there's about 18.6 million people living across the greater Los Angeles area. That arrow on the left there is pointing to Los Angeles International Airport, which is, depending on the year, between the 4th and 8th busiest airport in the world. And that arrow down there in the south pointing towards Long Beach is pointing at the ports, the combined ports of LA and Long Beach, which is the busiest container port in the United States. And with all those people and all those goods kind of moving through that region, what it means is that lots of non-native species are showing up. But how do you go about documenting these non-native species and potentially doing something about it when most of the landscape looks like that? As a biologist, how do I go about surveying habitat when every 10 steps I'm on a new piece of private property where I need a new set of permissions to do any sort of a survey? And what we realized sort of 2013 or so, shortly after I started at the museum, is we needed to stop looking at this landscape as the problem and start realize that actually this is the solution, because we can go in and we can ask dozens of people across these neighborhoods, to pull out these devices that we sort of call phones, even though we don't really use them for that much anymore. And we can ask them to pull out these smartphones and take photographs of what they see and upload them to platforms like iNaturalist, where those photos then become vouchers of where species can be found. And so this is what I started doing. The project that I started is something called the Reptiles and Amphibians of Southern California. We use the acronym RASCALS. This project was actually very much modeled after a project that many of you may be familiar with, a project called Herps of Texas, which existed prior to RASCALS and had been very successful here at documenting lots of reptiles and amphibians across the state. And so I thought we would do something similar in Southern California. But I also wanted to make sure that there was a really low bar to participation. So we also made sure that people could just email us observations at that rascals@nhm.org email address. Or if they're just active on whatever their favorite social media platform is, they can simply add the hashtag nature in LA, and our staff, volunteers, students will find those observations, contact the people, get the relevant data, and then upload those observations. And so the number that you can see up here, where it says this has got nearly 10,000 people participating, that's actually a huge underestimate, because there's probably about 3,000 more people who simply added via social media or emailed us observations that got uploaded by our museum account. Currently at about 74,000 observations. Let me just show you what these observations look like. This happens to, just doesn't really matter what species this is. This happens to be an introduced species. But what you get is you get one or a series of photographs. Those photographs can be used by people who participate on iNaturalist to identify the animal. So you get a community-supported identification. You also get locality data, latitude, longitude. Sometimes the person will enter an accuracy, or what most of us would think about as an error value, so you can understand approximately where that observation was made. You get a date stamp and you get a timestamp. And the beauty of smartphones is, of course, all of that information can come from a single device and can be almost immediately uploaded to iNaturalist. Those of you, because this event is sponsored by the UT Biodiversity Center, of course, that includes the Texas Natural History collections and the millions of specimens that are in those collections. And those folks who deal with specimens a lot, as I do as a curator, probably recognize that these photo vouchers are very analogous to historical museum specimens, which also act as vouchers of where a particular species was found at a particular point in time. And of course, these specimen vouchers are the backbone of every biodiversity assessment, every conservation assessment. And now we've got these iNaturalist photo vouchers that can be used for that kind of work as well. So when I started the Rascals project, one of my big goals for doing that was specifically to try to reduce the impacts of non-native species. So I wanted to identify any introduced species and ideally identify them early enough in the invasion process that maybe we could actually do something to keep them from getting established and spreading, as well as to try to identify and then have some opportunity to manage common introduction pathways. And I'm just going to, in order to demonstrate sort of this general philosophy to you, I'm just going to tell you a story. And the story begins in March of 2016. A person that at that point I had never met, his name was Patrick Gavitt, he posted this photo to iNaturalist. And when he posted this photo, multiple people on the iNaturalist platform, including me, identified this as our local native skink, a thing called the Western skink. And I remember thinking about this observation at the time because I thought, Western skinks don't do well in urban areas. So why would this skink be under a portable basketball hoop in this guy's, driveway? It doesn't make any sense. But it turns out his house is about 3 blocks away from the San Gabriel Mountains. And I thought, well, that's weird, but what else could it be? But it stuck with me that it was kind of weird. And then 2.5 years later, in August of 2018, Pat then posts this photo. And as soon as I saw this photo, I remembered that there was that photo from 2016. I realized that we probably misid'd that. And I immediately recognized that this is probably an African skink, very likely a thing called the African 5-line skink. Other people on iNaturalist recognized it as the same. This is a species that's somewhat popular in the pet trade. So I got a hold of Pat. I just messaged him over iNat. We started talking. We eventually started emailing. And a few weeks after he posted this, I showed up on a Saturday morning at Pat's house in this neighborhood. This is about 3 small cities east of Pasadena, just to kind of orient you. And Pat and I went for a quick walk around his neighborhood just to try to figure out, were these just a few individuals that Pat saw over a 2.5-year period, or is this actually an established population? And lo and behold, we're finding juveniles. Those are the bright blue ones there. We're finding adults, the one that you can see in the hand there. We're finding, recent hatchlings, juveniles, subadults, adults, and we're finding them over several square blocks. It's clear that this is an established population. This is the first time this species has ever been documented in the state of California. It's the second time a population has become established in the US. There's also a pet trade introduction in Florida. And so, but I never would have found this. No biologist would have very likely have ever been in this neighborhood and had seen these skinks cruising around. But because Pat had pulled out his smartphone, had taken these photos, had uploaded the observations to iNaturalist, we were suddenly able to learn about this particular observation. And so because, I never would have found out about this without Pat's help, I invited Pat to co-author a note in this journal called Herpetological Review. And in 2019, Pat, as a community scientist, became published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So he really got to experience, the scientific process from that initial observation, through to publication in the scientific literature. And so this really demonstrates, and I should say that we did we'd go door to door in this neighborhood. This is pre-pandemic, so you could do stuff like this easily. And you could knock on people's doors and they would come out and try to figure out what you're doing, looking at lizards in their front yard. And we talked to them and we realized that there's actually a person in this neighborhood who is a reptile importer and distributor. And these skinks actually, so we also, turns out they showed up in about 2015. And so it was only a year later that Pat took that first photo and only 3 years later that he took that second photo of an adult. So we were getting there pretty early in this introduction process. And I don't have time to go into this, but I'm happy to talk with folks about it afterwards. But we actually figured it was early enough in the introduction process that we could very likely eradicate this population as long as we could work with people in this neighborhood. And so we did that. We started in fall of 2018, getting permission to work in people's front yards and people's backyards. And up until spring of 2020, we removed 61 skinks, and no skinks have been seen, no non-native skinks have been seen in this neighborhood in roughly the past 30 months. And one of the things that we didn't know at the time, and actually didn't realize until about 2 months ago, is it turns out, as far as we can tell, this is the largest successful eradication of a lizard or snake that's not on an island. There's bigger eradications in island habitats, but never in a mainland situation. I think if I'd known that, I would have been more hesitant to start, but I'm glad we started because in fact, this seems to have been successful. And none of this, again, would have happened without this amazing community scientist, Pat Gavitt, making those first 2 initial observations. So I would love to tell you that this is a rare event, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. So what I'm showing you in this sort of big, hideous table is for 15 species, including a whole bunch of house geckos in the genus Hemidactylus, brown anole, green anole, some whiptail lizards, another Mediterranean species called an Italian wall lizard, a thing called the ocellated skink, Brahminy blind snake, and the coquille frog. For these 4 coastal Southern California counties, Ventura, LA, Orange, and San Diego counties, if as a result of community science efforts in the last 9 years, we learned about a new population. I'm going to put a little SR in one of these boxes if that's the first time that species has ever been documented in the state of California. If it's the first time it's been documented in that county, I'm going to put a little black CR. If we knew it was in that county, but then we've picked up distinct records like other populations, I'm going to put a little plus sign, okay? So what that looks like for the African five-line skink is just, that's the first state record and also the first county record. In the next slide, what we want to be rooting for is we want to root for as many of these cells as to stay empty as possible. Because if we're putting stuff into those cells, it means that we're defining that there's all these non-native species. Of course, if they're there, we want to detect them. But what we'd love is if we didn't have all these non-native species showing up. And unfortunately, that's not the case. In fact, what we found is we found 7 species in the last 9 years, actually 2 just this past summer, that have shown up for the first time ever documented in the state of California. We have 25 new county records, and we have a whole suite of situations where we knew they were in that county, oftentimes because we documented it through community science, and then sometime later we documented another population. And I should point out that for the daytime active lizards, so green anoles, brown anoles, we think the whiptails, the evidence is maybe a little bit more questionable there. Certainly for the Italian wall lizard. For these daytime active lizards, what we see is every time that they get established, they kick out our native lizards. So we know that they are having ecological consequences, at least in urban areas. And that's actually why we started the eradication of the African five-line skink, because we figured that they were going to do the same thing. I just want to point out that these are having some negative consequences. Now, again, prior to the pandemic, my former postdoc, Bree Putman, who's now a professor at CSU San Bernardino, we went door to door in some of these neighborhoods with green anoles and brown anoles, which are very conspicuous lizards. They have big showy dewlaps that the males are flaring out, so they're relatively easy to observe. And we'd ask people, how long have you been living here? And when did you first notice these lizards? And what we determined was that in many cases, these lizards, these green anoles and brown anoles, had been there for, in some cases, over 25 years before they were documented. And the only reason they were documented by the research community was, again, because of these community science approaches, which I think really highlights how community science is such a huge advantage over the ways in which these things were reported, because they basically weren't being reported prior to the development of these community science efforts. I also want to just point out everything that you see in green, where we know in the cases of the things that are in dark green, green anole, Brahminy blind snake, and coqui frog, we know those are getting moved around in the nursery plant trade, primarily tropical plants, things like houseplants, mostly coming in from Florida and or Hawaii. The things in that lighter shade of green, the 2 whiptail species and the ocellated skink, those are getting, most likely those are coming into California via the tree trade. So wholesale nurseries in Arizona shipping trees, and their trees are coming in big pots with lots of dirt in those pots. And these lizard eggs are very likely in those pots, or the lizards themselves, and those are coming in with nursery plant material. So just to highlight, not only are we detecting some of these invasives showing up, but we're also identifying some of these common management or some of these common introduction pathways. And ideally, we can then start to manage some of these pathways, although that's a whole nother set of challenges. So just to conclude this part, and I'll just read through this because it's a lot of text on a slide. So the bad news is that we've got numerous non-native species are being transported into urban environments. In part, this is through the nursery trade. There's also some stuff coming in through the pet trade. And this isn't just like small, snails, slugs, nematodes. This isn't, just small stuff that's hard to screen. The screening systems that we have in place right now are not even picking out large organisms like geckos and frogs. And some of these species are showing up and having ecological and economic consequences. Some of these non-native stowaways are establishing populations at wholesale nurseries. And then as those nurseries send plant shipments out across the landscape, they're basically establishing satellite populations elsewhere. And that's actually what happened with those green anole and brown anole populations that got established in the late 1980s. I think the good news, though, is that these community science efforts can absolutely provide occurrence records, even from areas like private property, residential properties that biologists can't otherwise easily access. And importantly, this is decreasing detection times, and it's identifying these common pathways of introductions. And I really want to hammer home this idea of decreasing detection times, because anybody who works in invasive species management, the mantra there is early detection, rapid response, EDRR. And I really feel like this community science approach really resolves the early detection component. And what that means is that's now putting pressure back on policymakers to have the funding mechanisms in place so that when species are detected, there's funding to get boots on the ground to actually do something about control. All right, so the big point here is just, I'm hope that I've convinced you that it's absolutely the situation that community science approaches are revolutionizing invasive species management by dramatically improving early detection. All right, so that's the first chunk. So we're going to skip to a whole nother topic here, in which I'm going to try to argue that community science is also revolutionizing ecological research. And this study is actually published, so I'm only going to spend a few minutes on it, because if you want to learn more, you can just read the paper. But here we're going to be talking about using community science to study ecological gradients in a difficult to observe character. And again, as I said, this was just published, I don't know, 14, 15 months ago. This was co-authored with my postdocs at the time, Bree Putman and Jane Lee. And a lot of the initial work on this was actually done by a post-bac student, Riley Williams. And Riley was actually funded on a totally separate project. He was funded to go do some urban reptile and amphibian surveys in 2 parklands in the Los Angeles area. But if it was foggy that day, then Riley was kind of sitting around the museum for a few hours. Or if it was warm that day, he would be done by 1 o'clock, and then he's sitting around the museum for a few hours in the afternoon. And so we started brainstorming about projects that, would sort of fit this kind of weird schedule that Riley had. And I said, well, I've been thinking about this thing for a couple of years, that I think that you could do, a couple hours here, a couple hours there. I think you could collect the data for this. And so the idea here was to basically look at predation pressure along an urban to rural gradient. And it just so happens that my favorite lizard in the world is down there in the lower right. That's the southern alligator lizard. And up on the upper left there is just a picture of a map of INAD observations. And so you can see in the most industrial parts of LA, you can find a southern alligator lizard. You can also go to 7,000 feet in the San Gabriel Mountains, and you can find a southern alligator lizard. And so what I was interested in was thinking about, do predation levels vary across this range? And the reason I was thinking about this is because I'm seeing people post observations to iNaturalist of owned outdoor cats interacting with lizards. So you can see on the right there, there's a nice orange cat there that has just attacked this southern alligator lizard, and that southern alligator lizard has autotomized its tail. That has very serious consequences for that lizard. Ideally, the cat is distracted by the flipping around tail, and so the lizard is able to escape. So the biggest consequence is survival. But then all the other consequences are pretty negative. Like if it's a female, she might very well forgo breeding that year. If it's a male lizard, when they autotomize their tails, they oftentimes will lose some of their territories. They may then have reduced breeding. Turns out that it also changes your physiological tolerances. So you may not be able to survive things like, cold snaps, which I'm sure all of you probably don't want to hear me say that word right now. Also has some limitations on upper limits of temperature tolerances. So lots of, and these lizards, they're somewhat arboreal, until the loss of that tail actually decreases mobility in arboreal situations. So lots of consequences. The lower left there, I know it's another orange cat. It is a different cat. Just take my word for it. My colleague, Maze Connolly, found this cat. It had a side blotch lizard in its mouth. The lizard was still alive. She convinced the cat to drop the lizard. As soon as that lizard hit the ground, it dropped part of its tail and it took off. So this got me thinking, I wonder if predation pressure is actually higher in urban places, because in those urban places, there's so many outdoor cats, whether they're owned outdoor cats or feral cats. And so our hypothesis was simply that predation increases with increasing urbanization in residential neighborhoods. And so what I asked Riley to do was to simply go into iNaturalist for a 2-year period. This was a few years ago, so it was 2016 and 2017, and look at every single southern alligator lizard observation from the 10 southernmost counties in California. And in doing that, he found over 1,700 observations. And for a huge number of those, he just looked to see, or for every one of those, he looked to see, can you see the lizard from the tip of its snout to the tip of whatever tail it has? And in doing that, we were able to then score, had that individual lost its tail at some point, had it experienced, a tail autotomy event. And I should just point out that for those who don't think much about lizards, oftentimes we use those tail autotomy events, those tail loss events, as a proxy for predation, even though there are other ways they can lose their tails, but we use this as a proxy for predation. because that's the main driver of tail loss. And so we just did that. So, Riley'd have 3 hours in the morning on Tuesday and 2 hours on Thursday, and then the next week, maybe 2 hours. And over a 4-week period, he was able to generate this huge data set. And so I'm just going to show you here on this particular slide, all that I'm showing you, and we can easily tell juveniles from adults because they have a big shift in color pattern. But what we're quickly able to do is generate this data set of 723 observations where in a photo we can see the entirety of the lizard's body. So we've got a whole bunch of adults and juveniles that I'm just showing you down here in the bottom part of this graph. This is simply saying across these varying levels of impervious surfaces, so varying levels of urbanization. Oh, you guys aren't seeing my pointer. I just realized that's a problem. Okay, so the bottom part next to the 0 is simply just showing all these individuals across different levels of urbanization who've never experienced a tail loss event. At the top side of that graph are individuals that had experienced the tail loss event. We just do some quick linear regressions here. What you can see is that for both adults and juveniles, as you go from rural places to much more urbanized places, the amount of tail loss increases, suggesting that the level of predation is also increasing. To put some numbers on that, what it means is that an adult alligator lizard in a very rural setting, like up in the San Gabriel Mountains, 54% of the time, those adults in those rural places had experienced a tail loss event. For adults in our most urbanized areas, which was mostly high density residential areas, 24 percentage point increase, right around 78% of individuals in that upper category had experienced a tail loss event. Really, my point here is actually less about alligator lizards, which I hate to say because it is such a cool lizard. My real point here is that these community science platforms, whether it's eBird or iNaturalist or some other platform that you're particularly passionate about, they are generating these amazing data sets that people can simply mine for trying to address whatever question it is that they want to address. There's no way that I could have gotten a similar data set on my own. We couldn't be out doing field work over such a narrow window of time, to have the number of boots on the ground that you would need. In residential areas, you're lucky if you find 2 of these, in an 8-hour day of searching. Sure, maybe you can find 6, 7 in the spring season, in the San Gabriel Mountains, but, you're never going to be able to generate a data set, this large, amenable to statistical analysis in such a short period of time without this sort of a crowdsourcing approach. So just to sort of highlight the second part, hopefully this demonstrates that, it's absolutely the case that these community science approaches are revolutionizing our ability to get large data sets of otherwise difficult to observe characters. And I should also just add that, it's not like when people were taking these photos, they thought, someone's going to come along one day and want to look at, tail loss. And so one of the things I think is really exciting, and this is true for museum specimens as well, is that the person who takes that initial photo, the person who collects that initial specimen, can really only try to imagine what are the ways in which that specimen or that photo are going to be used for research, for conservation efforts, decades or even centuries into the future. All right, so we're going to jump from thinking about ecological stories to thinking about some animal behavior and using community science to study rare natural history events. This is very similar to the previous story, but a totally different set of questions. And in this case, the rare natural history events are going to be basically lizard mating events. So again, southern alligator lizard, because why would you work on anything else? I say with people who are also in this room who work on a different member of this family. But you've got these lizards here. This is the lighter tan one is the male. This is their typical sort of mating behavior where the male bites the female on her head neck region. Through the work I'll be talking about, we now know that they can stay in this position for over 48 hours. And during this prolonged period of time, they might actually mate multiple times. And all this, I know people are like, how did I end up in a talk where someone's telling me about lizard sex? And the reason that people are interested in things like these basic natural history questions is because this basically drives a huge number of subsequent questions in animal behavior. So trying to understand how animals are communicating, trying to understand, how animals are interacting with each other. And so we'll get to some of those questions in just a minute. But here's a species that goes from Baja California, northern Baja California, through all of the non-desert parts of California, up into the western half of Oregon and into south central Washington. In other words, it spans a region of like, I don't know, 40 million people at the present time, dozens of universities, I mean, hundreds of universities, dozens of natural history museums, hundreds of herpetologists. So you must think, and it's the most widespread lizard in urban areas. So you must think like, we must know everything there is to know about the southern alligator lizard. But of course, most of you are passionate natural historians. And so, that's not at all the case. We oftentimes know very little, even about very common species. So what do we actually know about mating behavior in this species? Well, it turns out that there's a single publication there's actually two publications that address this, but the primary publication is this paper from 1972, in which Steve Goldberg reports 4 dates on which pairs were observed in this particular mating posture. And I asked Steve, he's actually a research associate at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. I asked him, hey, how did, I grew up in the Bay Area. I had alligator lizards in my backyard. I had them as pets. I never saw this mating behavior. Like, how did you get to see 3, when you were prepping this paper? And he goes, no, I never saw this. I told my students in my biology classes about this study I was doing, and they reported those 3 observations to me. So even he crowdsourced his collection of these observations as well. But he only had 3. And there's actually one other, we know of 4 total. There's another, if you look through the entirety of the peer-reviewed literature, all the field guides, there's 4 published dates on when pairs have been observed together. So that's what we know about this incredibly common lizard. We have 4 dates, but it's really just 3 from this particular paper. So I just thought, can we crowdsource the study of mating behavior? These lizards occur all over the place. Sure, any one person is very unlikely to see this, but what happens if we asked, 100,000 people to be on the lookout for it? How many observations could we then get? Also, I thought, this is kind of like a biological spectacle. People might have taken a photo or a video of this 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And if it was on a smartphone or a digital camera, at least has a date stamp, a time stamp, they might remember where it was. Or if it was on a smartphone, maybe it has latitude and longitude in the photos info file, like we can probably get past observations. So can we just crowdsource this? And a colleague of mine in marketing and communications came up with this great idea. She said, look, Greg, if you're going to publicize this in March, why don't you just publicize it on Valentine's Day? I can get you way more page hits if you do like a blog post and social media post on Valentine's Day. And I said, sure, I'm one heck of a writer. I mean, look at this. I can crank this out. As I read this to you, you'll realize that's sarcasm. So dear Los Angeles, we need your photos of alligator lizard sex. Remember, this is Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day. Love is in the air, but for more species than just Homo sapiens. Well, you might be thinking of roses, chocolates, and a candlelit dinner. Our local alligator lizards are devising their own romantic plans. Valentine's Day happens to be around the start of the alligator lizard breeding season in Southern California, and we need your help to study their breeding biology. And this was included with a whole bunch of photos, and it got lots of hits on social media. And we kind of do one of these blog posts every year. The first year, 2015, lizard love bites. That was late in the mating season, because I sort of thought of this after I started seeing all these posts on iNaturalist of mating pairs. And so the great thing about being at a natural history museum is that oftentimes you have these wonderful colleagues in marketing and communications. And so another colleague said, oh, I'm going to do a video of this and post it on social media and on YouTube. And on social media, that got lots of views. And of course, people can just add observations to iNaturalist, but because the people that are likely to see this probably aren't on iNaturalist, they probably just stumbled on it while they were out for an evening walk or something. We make it really easy to contribute observations by just emailing them to us. So what have we learned? I mean, we started doing this, and we get all these observations coming in. We get alligator lizards 4 feet up in the air in bushes, 4 feet above the ground atop fences in people's backyards, mating pairs right out on the front lawn, out on the sidewalk. People are, walking into these while they're walking through their local neighborhood. Maybe somewhat appropriately, here's a pair in the gutter. This in the photo I started this talk with, this is an amazing photo of 2 males interacting with a female in an apartment courtyard in Pasadena. You get, interesting observations like this. This is in Silver Lake. Lots of cool stuff goes on in Silver Lake. So what do we know about southern alligator lizard mating behavior from sort of the traditional approach of like what's in the literature? All right, we basically have these 3 observations from 2 Southern California counties. What can you do with 3 observations? Well, you can't really do much. You can't really make any general inferences. Like they probably seem like they breed in the spring. That's about all you can infer. What have we done in 8 seasons of doing this? So 8 years of doing this with community science. From Southern California, I have 592 records. From the rest of the range, so Central California, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, I have another 112 records. Sister taxon or closely related species, Algaria cerulea, 134 records for it. So we're looking at, the traditional approach gets you 3 records. This approach so far has generated 704. We'll start picking up some more later this month. With 704, you can obviously start thinking again about, doing some interesting analyses, like looking at variation across latitude. How is latitude driving, how's that impacting with the timing of breeding? What about elevation? What about weather and climate from year to year? If you think temperature is an important driver of when they breed, then maybe in urban areas where you have urban heat island effects, maybe that's actually causing them to breed slightly earlier. These are the kinds of questions you can start asking when you have so many observations. I'm pretty sure that the data set we've generated is the largest data set of mating behavior in a squamate. If people think I've missed something on that, and I know you're thinking there's got to be something in those northern Thamnophis, aggregate breeding populations, yes, there should be data sets bigger than this, but I can't find one from those. So let's just look at some of the year-to-year variation. The first thing I want you to look at is just in 2016. In 2016, we see a huge impact of local weather. The main bulk of the breeding activity is March 11th to the 26th. Then we get hit by a storm. It shuts down all the breeding activity. No big surprise there. I mean, these are sure they're not a big basking species. They're not like, they don't need to be super warm, but still they're not going to be out when it's raining and cold. A little bit of activity again as it starts to warm up on April 2nd. Another storm comes in, wallops them, and you get no activity until the 10th, and then we get a whole bunch of activity for the next week. So we can see the impact of local weather. What about more broadly across years? Well, everything I'm showing you there in that brown font, those are drought years. So 2015, all we got was 37 observations. 2016, all we got is 31. You jump to 2017, everyone thought 2017 was like this amazing rain year. It wasn't. It was like 2 inches above average, but we'll take it. It's California. This is all we get these days, is like barely above average is a good rain year. And we get 92 observations. Drought year, and again the next year, and it drops back down into the mid 30s. 2019, another pretty good rain year, like 2 inches above average, and we had 101 observations. Right. So you're seeing that it seems like we see way more breeding activity in these winters, right? When we have winters with good rain, we see a lot more breeding activity in the spring. I'll show you the next few years. Things get a little bit more complicated, starting with the pandemic in 2020, and that's just because there's a whole nother separate talk to give on that, which is how people have changed the ways that they're observing nature following the pandemic. But 2020 is a good wet year. Plus, people aren't allowed to do anything, so they're walking around their neighborhoods and they're seeing alligator lizards all over the place. We had a really wet December and then a record dry January and February. But still, alligator lizards are breeding. Drought year again knocks numbers back in 2021. Good wet year in 2022, except that it was a very wet December and then again a record, basically no rainfall in January and February. They didn't care. As long as they got their December rain, mating season was on. So it's interesting that we've now been able to sort of figure out that the trigger seems to really be about wet, good rains in the early part of the rain year. This year will be particularly interesting because we didn't get good rains in December until the last week of December, and then we had a super wet late December and January. So we'll see if, even though it was late December, is that still enough to trigger a lot of breeding activity this year? My guess is yes, but you can see how by doing this for multiple years, you're starting to learn a lot about what's driving mating activity. Other things that we found, about 9% of all observations involve multiple males. So if you're in animal behaviors, this is going to cause you to start asking questions like, well, what's going on in terms of behavioral interaction between these competing males? In other words, let's start thinking about intersexual selection. If a female's got these 2 males that are sort of biting on her neck for like 2 days, that makes you think, well, what's the role of female choice? And these are all standard questions in the animal behavior world. About 5% of observations are arboreal. So that might cause you to then think, well, how do courtship behaviors change with habitat type? Again, standard sort of animal behavior question. My guess is that these arboreal, these moving into arboreal sites probably has a lot to do with actually the male trying to get into situations where he's not going to get found by other males. We've also, when people send me an observation and I see that they're observing it right then, or they observed it in the last few hours, I'll contact them and say, hey, can you keep an eye on this? And so as a result of doing that, we now have 4 observations where pairs have been together for 48 hours. So that's again going to cause us to think about well, is this male mate guarding behavior? Like, is the male staying with the female to make sure that no other males come along? Or is this the female saying, I really want to assess, how long you can hold this sort of bite hold. And this is like somehow assessing the level of strength. And so this actually has caused biomechanics folks to then try to figure out what's going on with alligator lizards to maintain this bite hold for so long, because this is a rather incredible feat to be able to hold that muscle tension for a long period of time. All of these questions are just coming up from, all of this sort of this basic natural history that we're able to do through this crowdsourcing approach. And one of the things I want to point out is I've generated this data set of 704 observations. I live in a place where alligator lizards are generally around. I actually live in a condo complex where like biodiversity is eradicated via pesticides, but so I don't really see alligator lizards very much. But I have still never seen a pair of these in that bite hold, and yet I've generated this data set. The point being that crowdsourcing really gives us this opportunity to study events that any one person might very rarely see. Let's just say that you're not just into like alligator lizard mating behavior. No big deal. You can jump onto iNaturalist and you can find photographs of whatever your favorite species is. I just assume that everyone's favorite species is a lizard or snake. But you can, let's say you've made the choice in your life to work on mammals. No big deal. I'm sure you can find pictures of mammals mating too. Let's say that you're not into, mating behavior. What you're actually into is like predator-prey interactions. No big deal. You can go find lots of those on iNaturalist as well. Let's say that what you really want to care about is you care about what are the things that are eating your favorite animals. No big deal. You can find lots of those ecological interactions on iNaturalist as well. That photo in the upper right of the brown widow, that's an invasive species in Southern California, actually detected through a community science project in 2002. But that particular photo there actually inspired a project we called Widow Wars, in which we asked people to go out and photograph native black widows, non-native brown widows, and specifically to look in their webs and then also photograph their prey items, because we wanted to see are brown widows having a differential sort of impact on native species than say black widows might be. So again, that inspired it. So the last thing, I'm just closing here, and the last thing that I want to say is that, for the researchers in the audience, I encourage you to think about these online data sets like iNaturalist and eBird, because we're at a point where these data sets are oftentimes allowing us to answer questions that prior to this we never could have thought about answering. And so it's really up to us as researchers to sort of come up with those questions and go mine data sets like this to answer these questions. And then more broadly for everybody in the audience, researchers, community scientists, et cetera, natural historians who aren't yet participating in community science. I think a lot of us think a lot about, what can we as individuals do to confront this global biodiversity crisis? And, the standard answers are like, try to lower your carbon footprint, reduce, reuse, recycle. And I would suggest that another thing that should be on kind of our like top 5 list of things that we can do is we can create what I would call a biodiversity data legacy. We can participate in eBird, we can participate in iNaturalist, we can pull out our smartphones, and just as we go about our days, we can make observations. We can upload them to iNat, we can upload them to eBird, upload them to whatever your favorite platform is. And you're creating this legacy of data that, the landscape planners, the policymakers, the conservation biologists, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, are going to be able to use to make informed conservation decisions. So I hope that that's something that gets us all kind of excited and thinking about participating in this. I know that a lot of people in the audience today are already participating in some of these projects. So thank you for that. I hope that this has inspired you to keep doing that. And lastly, I'll just say, I feel really lucky to be at a natural history museum where I'm not only surrounded by great research colleagues, but I've got people in marketing and communications, and I've got specialists in informal education who can, help me craft, fun projects like this. And actually when I tell them I want to study alligator lizard mating behavior, they don't think that's like super weird. They're like totally into it and then create a video for me. With that, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be back on the UT campus, a place I've spent a lot of time in the past. Excited to chat with folks tomorrow as well. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. And I think we've got a couple moderators who will keep an eye on the chat as well to see if there's questions in the chat. I can't see the chat, so we'll see.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the great talk. That was excellent. If anyone would like to ask a question, why don't you turn on your video and use the raise hand function under the reactions button at the bottom you can raise your hand. If you don't want to turn on your video or can't turn on your video, then you're welcome to type a question into chat and we will we'll ask it for you.
Ooh, maybe I can see chat. No, I can't really.
There's a question from the other room here on the third floor of Welch. We were thinking, Greg, you say it's really unusual to see a mating pair of alligator lizards in that posture.
Yeah.
Given that they are that way for like 48 hours, why is it so unusual?
Yeah, not only are they in that position for a long period of time, but when they're in this position, they seem to make really bad choices a lot of the time. And I should say not they, I should say the males basically, the females don't really move at all in this position. They basically force the male to drag them, which again sort of makes you think maybe this is about assessing strength. But they'll end up, like, as you saw, in the middle of the lawn, super conspicuous. They'll end up on the sidewalk, they'll end up in these very conspicuous places. And so I think the answer is that, people do see them. If they're in neighborhoods where you have this species, they do sometimes see them, but it still seems to be, still the case that, I've never seen it. Steve Goldberg has never seen it. I've asked lots of herpetologists who live in the area. I asked Dave Wake once, has he ever seen this? And he said, no, I've got him in my neighborhood, but I've never seen it. That being said, there's an incredible community scientist who lives in sort of the southern part of the Los Angeles area. She sends me 3 to 5 observations a year from her yard. So if you have a yard where she really focuses on native plants, and I fear for any cat that walks into her yard, because like those lizards are loved and protected. And so that's why she's getting so many, is that their densities are so high. I think in other areas their densities are lower. And so it's just about, being lucky enough to, I would say lucky enough to come across this. Yeah. So I don't know if I really answered your question, Kelly, but I don't know why it is such a rare thing for many people, but if you're in the right spot, you do have the opportunity to see lots of individuals.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, see, we have a question. Go ahead.
Yes, so excellent talk. I have a question in terms of like sampling effort. Can it be corrected? Do you correct it? Thoughts on that? I realize it's a wide question.
No, that's a really important question. So the best way to think about that is that if I can go back here, the best way to think about that is a slide in which I did not correct at all for sampling bias. This one here. So comparing across years from 2015 to the present, all that you see iNaturalist, all that's going on iNaturalist is that iNaturalist is growing. And so when I publish these data, I'll absolutely correct for that sort of the overall growth of iNaturalist. And there's different ways to do that. The way that I would probably do it for a data set like this is to say, okay, well, I would use as my control, what are the number of, say, lizard observations or the number of squamate observations that are being posted sort of during that mating period. And so it's not really reasonable to compare across years, because we know the thing that like blows me away about this is that it's so consistent in the drought years that you had like 30 to 37, per year, even though we know that iNat is getting more and more use during that time. It's crazy that that's what we see for those first 5 years until everything kind of shifts in the pandemic. But I think my guess is that if the answer will change a little bit if you controlled for that, but it's not, the stories that I told you won't change at all, even if you control for that. But yes, I think you absolutely do want to control for it. And you can just do it by, thinking about what's the appropriate group to use for comparison. Yeah, that's one way to do it anyway. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then
Okay,
otherwise, I
great.
think related to that, they'll all say that, these observations are still presence-only observations, and so suffer from the same challenges that, say, museum specimens provide, in that they're also presence-only observations. So.
We have a question from Anat who asks, did you do anything to try to figure out if the observations were independent? Whoops, it just jumped. Were independent of different lizards,
Yeah.
particularly thinking about the tail autonomy study?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So because every single one of these observations is tied to a date stamp, a time stamp, and latitude and longitude, oftentimes with an error value. So what we did in the tail autonomy study is, and I forget the exact I forget the exact way we did it off the top of my head. I think what we said is that I think we excluded observations that had greater than like 100-meter accuracy value. And then we said something like, okay, if we have 2 points that are within like X number of days of each other, like 2 days of each other or something, and are within some distance, I just don't remember what the distance was. We then went through and individually looked at those photographs to determine whether that was the same individual. And it turned out that if we did that, whatever our window was, let's say it was 100 meters and say it was 2 days or something, whatever that window was, there was only 8 potential duplicate observations. So the obvious concern there is pseudo replication. But it turns out that for all 8 of those observations, based on the color patterns, they were all distinct. Now, the cool thing is I've done the same thing for the alligator lizard mating study, because again, sometimes you get observations where like one person sees 3 pairs over the course of a month in their backyard. And I've done the same thing for that, where then I'm like comparing the lizards, the color pattern, trying to figure out it's the same lizard. And last year, after 8 years of doing this, we finally figured this out last year. One person contributed observations in which the same male mated about 4 weeks apart, which I think is kind of amazing because, if you're in this bite hold for 24 or 48 hours, it's got to be hugely draining energetically. And then we see, whatever that was, I don't remember, 3 weeks later, that same male was mating with a different female. So anyhow, yeah, we absolutely think about that pseudo replication issue a lot.
Great. Well, we had several comments from INAT users who said that they're delighted to know that their data are being used in this kind of way, but they weren't really questions.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that comment. And again, I just want to emphasize that, it's just like with museum specimens where like, you just have no idea how these observations might get used, decades or even centuries from now. So there's already, I forget what the current estimate is. There's certainly well over 1,000 publications using INAT data. And lots more coming out every day. So observations are definitely getting used regularly. I see Larry had his hand up.
Yeah, Larry, do you have a question? I think you have to unmute.
Hi, great. Enjoyed your talk. And I had a question about 2020. That was the highest observations. That there could have been a little increase with naturalist activity during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's 100% what it is, Larry. That's why I said everything changed. So if you think about the alligator lizard mating season, right, it starts off in Southern California, at least in wet years, it starts off a little bit later than in dry years. So in wet years, it tends to start in mid-March. If you all think back to mid-March 2020, I mean, I don't know what was happening in Texas, but in Southern California, what was happening in mid-March 2020 is even the trailheads were closed. Like you couldn't go to work, you couldn't go to the museum, you couldn't even go hiking because we didn't know what was going on, but they didn't want people on the trails. So even the trails were closed, at least in most of the local parks. Griffith Park is closed down. Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area is closed down. Everyone's supposed to stay at home. What that meant is that the only way that people were able to kind of like get out and do something is they were taking walks in their neighborhoods. And so in most years, and I'm not like doing the GIS analyses, as these observations come in. And so what I do is I just roughly categorize them as like, is this an urban observation? Is it on the like urban rural sort of divide, or is it a rural observation? And in 2015 to 2019, I would say about 65 to 75% of observations are from urban places. Like people are seeing these in their backyard, in their front yard, out on a neighborhood walk. In 2020, the percentage that were urban jumped to like 96% of all observations were urban, and we got huge numbers of observations. And I think it's just completely because people were spending time in their backyard, spending way more time in their backyards and front yards. They're trying to get a break from sort of the pandemic situation. They're going for walks around their neighborhood. We got huge numbers of observations that year that were just people who were like, yeah, saw this on my evening walk. I'll check back tomorrow on tomorrow's evening walk to see if they're still there. So it's absolutely, the pandemic had a huge effect on how people were observing nature, especially in places like, LA. Yeah.
That's almost a separate publication to encourage more yard observations.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's the plan.
All right, we have one more question via
I've got
chat.
one here too.
Okay,
Go for it, but you can go with yours, David.
okay. Let's see. The question is, can community science allow direct control, local control of non-native organisms without expert intervention? So in other words, should a community science be encouraged to dispatch a non-native lizard? A community scientist be encouraged to dispatch a non-native lizard, for example?
Yeah, so this is going to vary from location to location, and the biggest issue there is actually illegal, and I mean illegal and an ethical issue. So in most states, there are some animals that you are legally allowed to dispatch, and that usually requires something like a fishing license or a hunting license, right? So like here in Texas, you know, a lot of deer are dispatched every year, right? Because by people who have hunting licenses. But if you were to go out in, say, California and say, well, I want to kill African 5-line skinks, that's actually not allowed with a hunting license. And the main reason for that is the ethical one, which is that we don't, just because the animal is, you know, it's not native, it's not its fault that it got there. You know, humans are the reason that it probably got there. And so it shouldn't be suffering. You know, if it's going to be euthanized, it should be humanely euthanized. And so we want to make sure that the people that are humanely euthanizing it are trained in how to do that properly. And so in most places, you can't go out and euthanize a non-native species unless it's something that's allowed under like a hunting license or a fishing license. You know, I'm not going to say that, you know, if you knew how to do that in a humane way and you didn't have the permits for it, you know, is that the right thing to do? I think that's up to each person's own sort of ethical dilemma. But yeah, lots of variation in that from location to location. You know, you look in Australia where you've got invasive cane toads, and it's basically, you know, the recommendation is you find a cane toad and you put it in your freezer to euthanize it, and that's the government's recommendation there for that particular species. But yeah, it just varies by location. And then there's a question here, you guys. I don't know if you've seen that there's actually people behind me, so we do have a question here.
Greg, this is John Cargis. One of the things that is really noticeable, particularly with the screen that you've got up right now, is how the lizards are adjusting to capitalize on that wet year and the consequences of that wet year for the largest potential of eggs and hatchlings following that wet cycle, so that there'd be abundant food. And it's almost like it's tied to boom and bust cycles, like you'd see in quail or something like that.
Yeah.
And it seems to be very stark on this representation you've got right now.
Yeah, was people able to hear that? Kelly, David, thumbs up if you heard John's. Okay, yeah. So I'll echo what John just said, because I completely agree with him. I mean, I think what these lizards are doing is they're, you know, a few months prior to breeding activity, they're, I think, assessing conditions. So they get a wet December, maybe even a wet January, and they say, yep, I'm going to put all my energy towards, you know, mating this year, because I know that in the spring you're going to have good vegetation growth, which means that in the late summer, when the eggs are hatching and all these juveniles are cruising around, there's going to be, you know, lots of insects to eat. And so they're going to have much higher survival than in a drought year. You know, you mate, and come August, when the babies are cruising around, what is there to eat when there hasn't been any, you know, it hasn't been much rain for an extended period of time. So I completely agree with you. I think that's what's going on. You know, we see that with lots of other species too. I think the thing that gets really interesting, and actually, you know, you would think would hide some of these patterns, is actually, okay, well, then urban areas, you know, in most urban places, right, it rains twice a week, right, when the sprinklers go off. So why do we, you know, but we're still seeing this really dramatic difference, even though we have large numbers of urban observations in places where we know that there's irrigation. So it seems like there's something else going on there. You know, they're still able to assess it's going to be a good year, but in urban places, irrigation doesn't seem to totally, you know, throw them off.
We almost be manufacturing good year.
Yeah, to sort of do to do an experiment here,
Right.
You know, have a neighborhood that overwaters in a drought year.
Yeah.
We have those neighborhoods. It's like called the Hollywood Hills. So maybe that's where I need to work. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have a final question from Celine, who would be interested in knowing about efforts to improve inclusivity and access to community science tools. She notes that could be important for broadening the scope of where the observations are coming from, especially in urban areas with many different communities.
Oh, totally. This is a huge, 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 huge effort in the community science literature, in the community science world right now, for exactly the reasons that were just pointed out, which is oftentimes for historical reasons like redlining, you get you get particular cultures that are very, that are in higher proportions in particular regions. And so what that means from a biological perspective is that if you're not reaching out to particular cultural groups, say groups that have been traditionally underrepresented in the sciences, or even in sort of the outdoor kind of field, like in sort of the hiking, backpacking kind of world, it might mean that you're also then, hugely undersampling a particular geographic region. Now that's the very sort of like scientific way to look at this. What it also means in a much more direct way is that you got lots of people out there who don't feel like this is something that they can do. And if we think about how do we get folks passionate about conservation, I think step one is getting people passionate about wildlife and habitats. And so for a variety of reasons, there's this recognition that we need to do a much, much better job of reaching out to a much broader audience in these community science efforts. And of course, I'm at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. We think about this a lot. I don't even know I wonder if I can actually show this to you. I can show you on the alligator lizard map, one of the reasons we started thinking about this. I realize most of you probably don't know LA, but if you do, what you'll immediately recognize is that those alligator lizard observations, and this is some years ago, but those alligator lizard observations, like that whole swath across, so that's the Santa Monica Mountains, is that big east to west sort of green area. Then you can see there's that whole swath that basically runs from Santa Monica to Burbank. It goes Santa Monica all through the Hollywood Hills and into Burbank. Down here, that little peninsula is called the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Those two regions on this map are the area of also probably the highest home values on this map. So we're getting lots of observations from people who are socioeconomically, more advantaged. And we're not getting as many observations from places, in South LA. And so because of this, we've actually done a lot of work to partner with organizations that are already well established in some of these communities. And we try to identify when we have goals in common. If there's a group in Compton, for example, that has a goal of trying to get people more people into the outdoors, then we try to partner with that group so that we have sort of shared goals and shared resources to try to do that. And we found that that's the most effective way to increase interest and participation in community science efforts from areas in which we've traditionally had that interest, much, much lower. So I hope that tries to get at it. I think I'll just say that, yeah, it's a huge area in the field of community science, and lots of organizations and efforts are being put towards trying to increase diversity in the group of people participating in these projects. So thank you so much for that question.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Larry, you still have your hand up. Is that from before, or did you have another question?
Oh, no, that was just left up by accident.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for attending, and thank you very much, Greg, for presenting this interesting talk. And
Give them a round of applause.
what's that? I'm sorry.
Let's give them a round of applause.
A round of applause. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you all. Much appreciated. Great to be here.
Thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.